My uncle called me a leech in front of the entire family. I didn't say a word. I just sat there in that conference room on the 14th floor of Hargrove and Associates, the firm my grandfather built from nothing in 1974, and I let him talk. Let him finish every single sentence. Let him wave his hands and loosen his tie and point at me like I was something he'd scraped off the bottom of his shoe. My cousin was sitting right next to him, smirking. My aunt had her arms crossed so tight she looked like she was holding herself together. And the estate attorney, Mr. Calloway, was doing that thing lawyers do when they want to disappear, studying the papers in front of him like they contained the secrets of the universe. I kept my hands flat on the table. I kept my face still. Because I already knew how this was going to end. I should tell you who I am first, so the rest of this makes sense. My name is Adrienne. I'm 31 years old. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, in a house that always smelled faintly of my grandmother's lavender soap, and the specific anxiety of a family where money was never discussed openly but always silently understood as the thing that mattered most. My grandfather, Walter Hargrove, started his company as a small commercial real estate brokerage. By the time I was born, it had expanded into property management, development consulting, and a small but profitable portfolio of mixed-use buildings across central Ohio. Nothing flashy, nothing you'd read about in Forbes, but solid, generational, built to last. He died 14 months ago. Heart attack sudden on a Tuesday morning while he was reading the newspaper at his kitchen table. The kind of death that feels both impossible and completely inevitable once it happens, because you realize afterward that you'd been bracing for it without knowing it. He left behind a will. And that will is what put me in that conference room. I need you to understand what my family thought of me. My uncle, Dennis, my father's older brother, took over the operational side of Hargrove and Associates about 8 years ago, after my father left to start his own consulting firm. Dennis is the kind of man who fills every room he walks into, not because he's impressive, but because he's loud. He has the confidence of someone who has never once been told no by anyone who mattered to him. His son, my cousin Kyle, is 28 and has worked at the company since he graduated college with a business degree he barely finished. Kyle is the kind of person who would describe himself as street smart to explain why his grades were bad. I, on the other hand, had a different path. After undergrad, I went to work for a commercial real estate investment firm in Chicago. Not the family company, because Dennis made it very clear when I was 22 that there wasn't really a role for me there. I spent 3 years in Chicago learning how distressed asset acquisition actually works. Then I got my MBA at Northwestern, concentrating in finance and real estate. Then I spent 4 more years at a private equity firm that specialized in mid-market commercial real estate deals in the Midwest. I knew cap rates. I knew debt service coverage ratios. I knew how to read a pro forma and find the 3 places where someone had buried bad assumptions. I knew, specifically and in great detail, exactly what Hargrove and Associates' portfolio was worth and where the dead weight was and what it would take to fix it. But to Dennis, I was Walter's granddaughter who'd gone off to play at being an executive and would eventually come home and need the family to take care of her. He said that. Not to my face. To my mother, who told me because she thought I should know. My grandfather called me 6 weeks before he died. This is the part I think about the most. He called me on a Sunday evening, which was unusual. We talked for almost an hour. He asked me about my work, my apartment in Chicago, whether I was eating properly. Then, toward the end of the call, he got quiet in a way that felt different from his usual quiet. He said, "Adrienne, I've been thinking about what I built and who understands it." I didn't say anything. I just listened. He said, "Dennis is a good operator day to day, but he doesn't see what's coming in this market. He's managing the past." I still didn't say anything. He said, "I want you to know I haven't forgotten you." That was all. We talked about the weather for a couple more minutes and then said goodnight. 2 weeks later, his attorney called and asked me to come in and sign some paperwork. A formality, he said, regarding an update to certain trust instruments. I drove down from Chicago on a Wednesday. I signed what I was asked to sign. I drove home. 6 weeks after that, my grandfather was gone. The will reading was scheduled for Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after the funeral. I drove down the night before and stayed at my mother's house. She made pasta, and we didn't really talk about what the next day might hold, which was its own kind of talking. The conference room at Callaway and Reeves was on the 14th floor of a building in downtown Columbus. Floor-to-ceiling windows, a long table of dark wood, the kind of leather chairs that cost more than most people's first car. Mr. Callaway was already there when I arrived. Dennis and Kyle arrived together 10 minutes late in the middle of a conversation they didn't bother to pause when they walked in. Dennis's wife, my Aunt Pamela, arrived right behind them. She sat next to Dennis and immediately took out her phone. Nobody greeted me directly. Kyle glanced at me, looked away, looked back at me the way you look at something in a store that you don't think you can afford but you're annoyed to see there anyway. Mr. Callaway began reading. The will opened with the expected things. Personal property, sentimental items. My grandmother had passed 4 years earlier, so there were bequests to various cousins. To my father, to a charitable foundation my grandfather had established. Then Mr. Callaway reached the section on Hargrove and Associates. And that's when Dennis sat forward. The operational control of the company, the day-to-day management authority, the signatory rights on the operating accounts was left to Dennis, as expected. Dennis actually made a small sound, something between a breath and a laugh, when Callaway read that part. Kyle straightened up beside him. Then Callaway kept reading. The controlling interest, 54% of the equity in the holding company that owned Hargrove and Associates and all the properties underneath it had been placed 18 months prior into a trust whose sole beneficiary, upon Walter Hargrove's death, was me. The room got very quiet. Not quiet the way a room gets quiet when something good happens. Quiet the way a room gets quiet in the seconds after a car accident, when everyone is still figuring out what just happened. Dennis looked at Callaway. Callaway continued reading without looking up. Kyle looked at his father. I kept my hands flat on the table. It took Dennis about 45 seconds to find his voice. That's not possible, he said. Mr. Callaway paused. He said patiently that he was reading the document as executed and he could make copies available for review. She doesn't even work here, Dennis said. His voice had gone tight and high in a way I'd never heard before. She hasn't worked here a single day. She went to Chicago and played around at some investment firm, and now she's 31 years old and she's supposed to control the company my father built? Callaway said again patiently that the trust instrument was clear. Dennis turned to me. You knew about this, he said. It wasn't a question. I looked at him. I said Mr. Callaway should probably finish reading. That made it worse. I could see it make it worse in real time, the way Dennis's face went from confused to furious, the way he registered that I wasn't surprised, that I wasn't scrambling, that I was sitting there calmly while his whole understanding of the last 8 years rearranged itself. Kyle said, Dad, this has to be challengeable. He was sick, there's grounds for. Dennis put his hand up sharply. Kyle stopped. Adrienne, Dennis said. And the way he said my name made it sound like a mistake someone had made. You are 20 years removed from this company. You don't know these properties. You don't know the staff. You don't know the relationships we've built. You have a degree and some years at a fund in Chicago that has nothing to do with family business. You would run this into the ground in 18 months. He paused. And I want you to understand that we were in a law firm's conference room, in front of an estate attorney and 2 paralegals and my aunt who had put down her phone. He said, You're exactly the kind of person my father should have known better than to trust with something real. You've never built anything. You've only ever observed. My aunt was very still. Mr. Callaway had set down his papers. I looked at Dennis. I said, Are you finished? He was not finished. He spent the next several minutes explaining, in escalating detail, why my grandfather had made a mistake, that Walter was in his 80s and had been showing signs of cognitive decline, which was news to everyone in the room, including my aunt, who I watched carefully and whose expression told me this was not a claim she recognized. that the trust must have been set up at a time when Walter wasn't thinking clearly, that he, Dennis, had given the best years of his career to that company, and his son was positioned to continue that legacy. And what my grandfather had done was not just misguided, but borderline cruel. He used the word cruel twice, and then he said, "She has never made a real decision in her life. She is not equipped for this. She is a liability." Kyle said quietly, "She'd be a disaster." And here is the thing I need you to understand about that moment. I had been waiting for it. Not that specific word, not that specific sentence, but that moment. The moment when they had said the absolute worst version of what they thought of me, out loud in front of witnesses, while believing they were in control, because I had spent the previous 6 weeks, after I signed those documents, after I drove back to Chicago, after I had several very long calls with my own attorney and 2 very specific conversations with Mr. Calloway, preparing for exactly this. I reached into the bag I had set on the floor beside my chair and placed a folder on the table. Then I placed a second folder next to it. Then a third. These were not dramatic props. They were 3-ring binders, actually. The kind you buy at Staples, each one tabbed and organized. I slid one across the table to Dennis, one to where Mr. Calloway was seated, and kept one for myself. Dennis looked at the binder in front of him and did not open it. I said, "I spent the past several weeks doing a full review of the current portfolio, all 14 properties. I pulled the rent rolls, the maintenance logs, the outstanding service contracts, and the most recent appraisals. I also pulled the operating account statements for the last 2 years." Dennis said, "You don't have access to—" "I do," I said. "As the trust beneficiary with controlling interest, I have had access since the day we were notified. Mr. Calloway can confirm the timeline." Mr. Calloway confirmed the timeline. I said, "Tab 3 in your binder is the vacancy analysis on the Westerville Strip Center. It's been running at 41% vacancy for 11 months. The anchor tenant left because the HVAC system failed twice in one winter and was never properly repaired. I pulled the service records. The cost to fix it properly when it first failed was around $9,000. The cost of losing the anchor tenant and retenanting at current market rates is closer to $240,000 when you factor in the free rent concessions required to attract a replacement." Silence. Tab 5 is the Clintonville mixed-use building. There's a deferred maintenance backlog of approximately $380,000 that doesn't appear anywhere in the current financial reporting. It's not hidden, exactly. It's just not being tracked in a way that's visible to anyone looking at the summary financials. Kyle opened his binder. He was on tab 1, trying to find his bearings. "Tab 8, I said, is the one I'd like Dennis to look at specifically." Dennis still had not opened his binder. I said, "Tab 8 is a summary of the management fee structure. Hargrove and Associates currently charges management fees at a rate that hasn't been adjusted in 6 years. Industry standard for this portfolio size is between 4 and 6% of collected rents. We're charging 3.2. On an annualized basis, that's approximately $90,000 in fees that are simply not being collected. That's not a disaster. It's a correction waiting to happen." Dennis said, "We have relationships with these tenants. You don't change the fee structure on it, Dennis." My voice was level. "I'm not asking for your approval. I'm telling you what I found." He came back at me the way I expected him to, which is to say loudly. He said I had walked into that room with a pile of spreadsheets and thought that made me qualified. He said relationships in commercial real estate were built over decades, not assembled in 6 weeks of document review. He said I had no idea what it was like to get a call at 10 o'clock at night because a pipe had burst in a tenant's space, to smooth things over with a city councilman who was upset about a zoning variance, to manage the 37 people who worked in that company and depended on it for their livelihoods. He wasn't entirely wrong. I said so. I said, "You're right that I haven't managed the day-to-day, and I'm not suggesting you leave. The operating agreement gives you the management authority, and I'm not here to take that from you." Something shifted in his face. Just slightly. I said. What I am here to do is exercise the oversight function that the trust instrument assigns to the controlling interest, which means financial reporting transparency, capital allocation decisions above a threshold that Mr. Calloway's office will document, and strategic decisions that materially affect asset values. I let that sit for a moment. Then I said, but I want to go back to something you said earlier, Dennis. You said I've never made a real decision, that I've only ever observed. I opened my binder to a tab he didn't have. 4 years ago, the fund I worked for in Chicago evaluated a portfolio acquisition that included a mixed-use property in Indianapolis, a light industrial park in Fort Wayne, and 3 retail centers in suburban Cincinnati. The deal was initially valued at $61 million. My analysis identified structural issues in the retail valuations and a lease rollover risk in Fort Wayne that the seller had buried in the appendices of the rent roll. We renegotiated the purchase price to $53 million and restructured the Fort Wayne financing. 22 months later, we sold the Fort Wayne property alone for $31 million. I looked up. I have made real decisions, they just weren't yours to see. The room was quiet in a different way now. Kyle had stopped flipping through his binder. My Aunt Pamela was watching me with an expression I couldn't fully read, somewhere between unsettled and something else that might have been reassessment. Dennis was looking at the table, and then he looked up at me, and what I saw on his face was not surrender exactly, but the specific exhaustion of a man who has just realized that the conversation he thought he was having is not the conversation that was actually happening. He said, "Your grandfather talked to you before he died." It wasn't a question. I said, "He called me a lot toward the end." Dennis made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh and wasn't quite a sigh. He said, "He always thought you were sharper than you let on." I didn't respond to that. He said, "What does this look like, practically, going forward?" This is the part that doesn't make for a satisfying movie scene, but it's the part I think actually mattered. I told him what I wanted, and it was not what he expected. I didn't want to push him out. I didn't want to swoop in and rebrand and restructure and put my name on things. My grandfather had built that company over 50 years, and the people inside it, the property managers and the maintenance supervisors and the leasing agents who had worked there for a decade or more, they deserved stability, not a power struggle played out over their heads. What I wanted was a seat at the table for capital decisions, proper financial reporting, an independent audit of the deferred maintenance backlog, and a management fee correction phased in over 18 months so as not to damage the tenant relationships Dennis was right to protect. I also wanted Kyle assigned to work directly with the property management team on the Westerville releasing effort because that situation needed focused attention and he knew the local brokers. That last one surprised him, I think. He looked at Kyle, and Kyle looked at me, and I said, "You know this market. You've been working it for 6 years. That's real value. Use it on something that needs it." Kyle didn't say anything, but something in his posture changed. We were in that conference room for 2 hours and 40 minutes. We left with a signed term sheet outlining the framework for how the controlling interest and the management authority would coexist going forward. Mr. Calloway had a document ready. I had sent him the draft the previous Thursday. Dennis shook my hand at the door. It was a firm handshake, not a warm one. That was fine. I wasn't there for warmth. My Aunt Pamela stopped me in the hallway while Dennis and Kyle were waiting for the elevator. She said, "Walter talked about you a lot this last year." I said I didn't know that. She said, "He was proud of you." I don't think he knew how to say it directly. He wasn't built that way. She paused. Dennis isn't either, but he's not a bad man. He needed someone to show him the shape of things. I thought about that for a long time afterward. The Westerville property signed a new anchor tenant 7 months later. Kyle negotiated the deal. He called me when it was done, which was the first time he had ever called me for a reason that wasn't required. The deferred maintenance audit came back at $412,000, higher than my initial estimate. We approved a capital expenditure plan over 2 years. It's on track. The management fee correction rolled out in January. 3 tenants pushed back. 2 of them came around. One of them we lost. And that's okay. They had been on a below-market lease that was up for renewal anyway, and the replacement tenant is paying 18% more per square foot. I moved back to Columbus. I have an office in the building now, which still sometimes feels strange. The building my grandfather walked into every morning for 40 years, that has his name on a plaque in the lobby, that smells like old carpet and fresh coffee, and the particular specific history of everything he built. I eat lunch alone in there sometimes and think about that phone call on a Sunday evening, the quiet at the end of it, and what he was really saying when he said he hadn't forgotten me. I want to say something about the people who told me I was a liability, because I don't think Dennis is the villain of this story, even though he played the villain in that room. He was scared. He had spent the better part of a decade running a company and pouring himself into it, and the prospect of losing control of it to someone he had already written off. That's a real fear. And it came out as contempt because that's how that kind of fear usually comes out. The thing I learned from working in private equity more than any technical skill is that the most dangerous problems in any organization are the ones that live in the gap between what people know and what they'll admit they know. The deferred maintenance that never makes it into the summary financials. The vacancy rate that nobody puts in a quarterly report because it's uncomfortable. The management fee that never gets adjusted because the conversation would be awkward. My grandfather knew I could see those gaps. I think that was why he called me. He didn't leave me controlling interest to punish Dennis. He left it to me because he wanted someone watching the whole picture, not just the parts that were comfortable to look at. I try to do that. Some days I'm better at it than others. Kyle texted me last month with the question about a lease clause on a new deal he was evaluating. I answered him. He sent back a thumbs up and then, after a pause, a second message that just said, "Thanks, you're actually kind of good at this." I stared at that text for a second. Then I put my phone down and got back to work. There's something nobody tells you about being underestimated for a long time. After a while, you stop trying to correct it. Not because you've accepted it, but because you've realized that the people who've already decided what you are will not be moved by your words. They will only be moved by facts they can no longer argue with. Dennis didn't think I was capable because he had never watched me work. He'd only ever seen me at family dinners, at holiday tables, at the edges of conversations about a company I was never invited into. He built a version of me in his head, and he lived with that version for a decade. And by the time we sat across from each other in that conference room, his version was so settled and so certain that my actual presence barely registered as a challenge to it. That's not unusual. That's just how people work. We make up our minds early and then we look for evidence that confirms what we already believe. Dennis looked at me and saw someone who had left, who had gone off to do something abstract and distant and unconnected to what he valued. He never looked close enough to see what I'd actually been doing. But here's the thing about the work I put in Chicago, at Northwestern, at that fund. I wasn't doing it to prove something to Dennis. I wasn't even thinking about Dennis most of the time. I was doing it because I was genuinely curious about how things worked, because I found something I was good at, and I wanted to be better at it. Because the problems in front of me were interesting and I wanted to solve them. That's the part that I think matters most when I look back on it, because if I had been spending those years building a case against my uncle, I would have been smaller for it. I would have been defined by the thing I was reacting to rather than the thing I was reaching toward. The work would have been angrier and probably not as good, and when I walked into that conference room, it would have shown. What Dennis got instead was someone who had genuinely learned things, who had sat with a busted deal in Fort Wayne at 2 a.m. trying to figure out where the numbers had gone wrong, not because she was trying to outperform her uncle someday, but because that was the job and the job mattered. The competence in those binders wasn't assembled for that meeting. It was assembled over years of just doing the work as well as I could do it. There's a cause and an effect to that. It's not mystical. You spend years building real skills. You end up with real skills. You spend years cutting corners and relying on relationships and avoiding the uncomfortable analysis. You end up with a vacancy problem you can't explain and a maintenance backlog nobody wants to talk about. Dennis is not a bad man. I meant that when I wrote it, and I mean it now. He ran that company faithfully for a long time. But faithfulness and excellence are not the same thing, and my grandfather knew the difference. I think about Kyle sometimes. The text he sent, the 2 sentences, the pause before the second one. What I heard in that message was someone deciding, maybe for the first time, that I was worth taking seriously. That's a small thing, but it isn't nothing. It took a real deal with real stakes and real results to get there. You can't argue your way into someone's respect. You can only build something true enough that they eventually have to look at it. That's what I know. That's what I carry out of all of it.